Good morning. Ayin Beis, volume 3. We are middle of page 1338. 1338. Aleph Shin Lamed Ches. So a brief overview of maybe the general flow of Ayin Beis, and specifically where we are up to right now. So we're 1,338 pages, 1,338 pages into the Hemshech, which we've been learning now for over 10 years, almost daily, and began the centennial in 2012. Now we're 2022, 2012, 2011, which was 100 years from when the Rebbe Rashab first delivered Ayin Beis in 1912, Shavuos. And as I've mentioned many times, in one word, the whole Ayin Beis is about interface. Interface between divine and existence, which is the whole purpose of creation in the first place. To make a dira b'tachtenim, which is another way of saying interface, a dira to lo yizbarach, a home for God in this tachtenim, in this lowest of worlds, in this material world, as the Alter Rebbe establishes and explains in chapter 36 in Tanya. And doing so, that Rebbe Rashab lays out really I would say, a compendium and a fusion of all the different sugyas, all the different themes and concepts and doctrines within Chassidus Chabad in general. So when you learn Ayin Beis, you see he's bringing and calling and citing and explaining all types of Maimorim from all those that came before the Rebbe Rashab. His father, the Rebbe Marash, the Tzemach Tzedek, the Mittler Rebbe, starting from the Alter Rebbe. And what's so powerful about it is that he joins them together. When you learn them by each of the Rabbeim, or even when you learn them by individual Maimorim of the Rebbe Rashab, you don't see that, that entire mosaic. So that's one thing. In addition, it also gives you the whole big picture of it all. In addition, just to make it even clearer, that he also brings from the Baal Shem Tov and the Magid, especially the Torah of the Magid, which we are actually middle of over a 500-page parentheses, all explaining a Torah of the Magid. So it doesn't take a lot of imagination to realize that the Rebbe Rashab, just as he's bringing from all the Rabbeim, he's really bringing all of Chassidus. And the Magid takes one Torah of the Magid, which is only 10 lines long, and turns it into hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pages of explanation. So really, this is the theme of Chassidus Chabad, the interface. And if you broaden it, is the theme of all Kabbalah. The whole point of understanding the spiritual worlds and the spheres and all the Yechudim, Elyonim, all the different unifications and the different ways what we accomplish through different mitzvahs and through different prayers and through the holidays and through Shabbos and so on, is all about connecting to God, having a relationship with God. And if you broaden it even further, it's actually the theme of Kol HaTorah Kul. That's what the Torah is. God married the Jewish people. Yem Chasanas is Matan Torah. Matan Torah was a marriage. And the Torah was the marriage contract. Essentially, God's mandate, God's wisdom, God's will, his blueprint for existence, which he gave to us, which serves as an interface for us to understand God and for us to connect with God. So it's all really the central theme of Judaism, if you really broaden it. But however, obviously, when you learn halacha, a Jewish law and Shabbat, Hilchos Shabbos, you're learning about a detail of the mechanics of it, which is also part of it all. When you learn Chassidus, you're learning the Pnimius HaTorah, the neshama of it all, and the inner purpose and the actual discussion about the interface. So even when you're doing a simple mitzvah like lighting a Shabbos candle or putting on film or something like that, when I say simple, it's not simple, you're also interfacing the divine and existence, whether you know it or not. Chassidus explains the process of how we do it. So in explaining the dynamics, you could say the science of this interface, and of course, it's not just a science, it's meant to be applied science, applied to our lives. The Rebbe Rashab sets out, first thing he establishes what Keser is. From page 1 in Ayin Beis, Keser is the most dominant theme that keeps on cropping up, because Keser in Kabbalah is that memutza between Atzilus and that which is higher than Atzilus. Or in the language of Chassidus, Keser is Ratzon. the will of God is the first step. The first step, if somebody wants to connect with you, they have to want to connect with you. There's no ratzon, there's no desire, there's no will, there's no connection. So in the language of Chassidus, that's Keser, the Keser of every world, and the general Keser. So Keser is always, throughout Ayin Beis, you see it come up again and again. It's not the only part of the interface. Atzilus is an interface, Torah is an interface, Mitzvahs is an interface. So if you really start learning, remember, interface, when you look even at a piece of engineering, it's never one thing, that's the interface. How many interfaces are there on a smartphone that from the point of what's going on in the back end to the point of the front end that the user can touch the screen and get what they want? There are hundreds of steps, if not thousands. And the same thing with any machine. How much more so, Seder Shtalshlus is really a series of interfaces, or if you wish, call it rungs of a ladder or stepping stones to climb from one level to the other. So it's really a multitude, an infinite amount of steps that we have to go through when you create this integration. Ayin Beis goes through many of them. Obviously, you can't go through infinite amounts, but enough to lay out the main groundwork, the main infrastructure that allows us, one, to understand God, and number two, to connect with God. So in Ayin Beis, in the flow of Ayin Beis, from the beginning, Keser, but in order to understand Keser, which is Ratzon, remember, that's not the only interface. We also know that's the will of God, which is more of a, we can say, more of a seamless and shapeless will. It's a will for existence, but it's still not defined. So then come the Pnimi, that's like an Makif. Then comes Pnimi, is the 10 faculties, or the 10 spheres. So the first part of Ayin Beis, you could say the first half of volume 1, almost the first half, a little less than the first half, focuses on what is Pnimi, what is the actual structure of existence, basically the map and the DNA of the cosmic order. And that is the 10 spheres, all the way originating from the 10 hidden spheres as they evolve downward, which is the main focus of the theme of how from non-structure became structure. Basically, from the Ratzon to desire existence, how did that turn into the actual details of existence, and how does that relate? So you really immediately see interface language all the time of how first God envisions existence, and how through the infinite possibilities, Shir Atzmei B'Koyach, he envisions one possibility, which is the 10 hidden spheres. And from the 10 hidden spheres will emerge, after the Tzimtzum, the 10 revealed spheres. And he goes through all the stages of how that goes through 3 different stages in spheres itself, because the sphere comes from the word mispar, number, and from narrative, and from sapir, transparency. And then he moves back. Well, actually, the order is a little different, but then he goes back to makif. So we have right there 2 forces in this interface, is the transcendent energy, which is makif, like Keser Ratzon, and there's the immanent energy, which is internalized divine energy, and that's the 10 spheres. And that's the interplay of understanding the difference between the 2. And then, just as there are 3 levels in the immanent spheres, there's also 3 levels in Keser. 3, again, is always interface language. One that relates more to the lower level, one that relates more to the higher level, and something in between both of them that connect them. So Keser has all those 3 things. And that's what you always need to have. Then the second half of Ayin Beis, which starts Shavuos Ayin Gimel, begins a discussion more about these 2 forms of energy, but he calls Er HaBligvul and Er HaGvul, where Er HaBligvul's main purpose is to create bittul ha'elements, to create a sublimation of existence by experiencing something that is beyond them. And Er HaGvul is to internalize it within the structure. So you need, again, both sides, and explains that's essentially the difference between the Aves and Matan Torah. That the work till Matan Torah, the first 26 generations, and specifically from Avram till Matan Torah, was primarily the work of realigning existence after the Chet Tzadas and the sins to the divine that relates to existence, the immanent, Er HaGvul, Kel Shaddai. And Matan Torah came and introduced a Er Chadash, because in this interface, you don't just want to connect to the divine that relates to existence, which is like I've explained back then, it's like cleaning up the pipes of the cosmic order, getting rid of the negative, the pollutants and the toxins, so we can relate to and align existence to the way it was meant to be, but we want a connection to the divine that's beyond just the structure of existence. So that's the Er Chadash that Matan Torah introduces. And that's the second part of the Hemshech, where he goes at length into that. And part of that also a discussion of the interfaces that Torah comes, Matan Torah comes to serve and bring that new form of energy. And then he goes into a discussion at length in the different ways that these two forces interface with each other, which leads us to where he speaks about the pasuk in Yeshaya in volume 1, where the other verse that I always Asa Pella, what does he say? The language. It's another pasuk. Well, essentially, the connection of Reimamus, which is another name for Keser, with existence. And he goes into a whole explanation of that. Just looking here, I'm looking with... okay, I'll find at some point. Okay, yeah, here we are. Havaya lekei ata eremimcha, oida shimcha ke'asisa pele eitzes merachik amuna uman. Looking at chapters 184 and Ayin Beis. Okay. And just to summarize that, so Pele and Aleph are the same letters. Pele refers to the level of Keser. Aleph refers to the level of Chochmah. Aleph is Chochmah. Chochmah and Keser are essentially, Chochmah represents the immanent spheres, the internal energy. Pele represents wonder and awe, the transcendent energy. And these two interact with the two interpretations in Zohar that either Aleph is a Keli to Pele, same letters, or Aleph actually is Pele. Basically, two stages of how integrated they become. And that leads into a whole discussion of what exactly is Aleph. Aleph, Neshem Ma, the bittul of Chachma, because bittul is always a key to create connection. When one level doesn't have bittul, it won't connect to the higher, like he says in Tanya, that all Kedusha is based on something being bottled to godliness. Something that's bottled, that's Kedusha, that's called holiness. If it's self-contained entity, it's about itself, not about the divine. So he goes into all discussion, what is Ma, Shem Ma, Mili Alfin of the Shem Ma of Havaya, discusses the whole difference between Toyu and Tikkun, a balanced alignment of the interface or an imbalanced one. It goes to all different scenarios. And that leads us into a whole discussion there about, we talked about it recently also about the Metzach of Ak, of again, different ways of explaining how higher levels come down into lower levels, etc., etc. Not going to go through the details of that. But that leads us into the next so-called theme, which is Arimimcha Lekai HaMelech. Close to the end of volume 1, he says there are two interpretations in Arimimcha Lekai HaMelech. One is Mamay Lamata, that we bring the Reimamus of Keser into Lekai HaMelech, which is Elikim Melech, of the spheres. You bring the transcendent energy of Reimamus Keser into the immanent energy of the divine within existence, or Malmata Lamaila, we elevate the spheres to Reimamus and to Keser and all the way higher up. And that begins the next section, which is the two interpretations. That leads us into volume 2, where he goes into four different, when he talks about the Kei HaMelech, what exactly is that? So he speaks about 4 different relationships, which is Koyach and Poel, potential and actual. You have the Agilia Helam, revealing the concealed, Yesh Ma'ayin, and Etzem and Ispashtus. So these 4 relationships, again, part of the interface of how different entities relate, how the divine relates to us in 4 different ways. That brings us back to the 2 interpretations that are Mimcha Lekai HaMelech. One, he says, is Tefillah, from the bottom up. Torah is from the top down. And that's when he introduces the Magid's Torah Naseh L'Chashtei Chatzetzes, which means you should craft 2 trumpets. That Chatzetzes, the Magid says, is a combination of 2 words, Chatzit Tzuras. That's again interface, 2 halves of an image. And the one half is the divine. The human being created in the divine image is the second half. And the goal is to bring them together. And the Magid Status talks about how do you bring these 2 opposites together. And that begins a parenthesis that is all about Momata Lamaila, Arimimcha Lekai HaMelech through Tefillah, Momata Lamaila. We're in the middle of that parenthesis, actually. In around 20 pages, we're going to come to the end of it. We're not far from the end of this parenthesis. Basically, yeah, around 10 pages, actually. Less than 20, 10 pages. So we've been learning that for years already, this parentheses, which goes a whole explanation of how these two join together. And here he introduces a new theme, the parsois. Till now, we've been talking the interface as in one level connecting to the other. But remember, we also have to account for the distance between creation and creator. And the parsa essentially is the so-called, what's the word? I say the market correction is not the right word I want to use, but it is the other side of the coin that when God wants to create something that takes a leap, a parsa is a partition. The partitions are necessary in ishtalshus as well, just as the hamshacha. When you, for example, from the mind to the emotions, you also need to have, however, the channels through which it travels. And he introduces the whole concept of parsois and how we deal with that. And that leads us to the question, how, okay, it's fine to say that the divine interacts and interfaces with existence, but at the end of the day, there is a fundamental symptom between the two. Because like the Arizal says, Tzimtzum Arishin, if the Eir Ein Sof was completely unfiltered and flowing in its pure, simple, seamless, and shapeless form, there'd be no room for existence. Like a brilliant teacher that simply occupies all space and there's no room for another. So all of existence is predicated on that Tzimtzum, or in lower levels, a parsa between Atzilus and Biyah. So the question is, how do we bridge that? How do we account for that? So it's true that Tzimtzum is necessary because that's the only way there can be a relationship. But can we actually connect to pre-Tzimtzum reality? And that begins a long discussion in the Pesach and then the Shavuos Mamorim. Now we're moving to the second half of Ayin Beis, volume 2, where he starts talking about the idea that the whole purpose of the Tzimtzum is not Tzimtzum, it's Gilui. So the truth is, the goal is not to bypass the Tzimtzum, not to override it, but to transform it. And when you transform it, then even the Oyer before the Tzimtzum, that initially we could not contain, we could not even exist in its presence, but like a student that becomes acclimated and trains itself, we transform and we expand our containers and our channels that we can even access the Oyer before the Tzimtzum, because the purpose of that, all that Oyer is to come to us after the Tzimtzum. However, it needs to do step by step. You can't just jump and leap. And the whole purpose of concealment is in order to reveal. And that leads him to the next section where the Shavuos Maimorim of Ayin Hey, where he talks about V'yadaita Yem v'shavesa levavecha ki havayu elikim b'shamayim emal v'oretz mitachas ein oid. And we're also in the middle of that theme. So these are all the themes as they tie together. What is the essential theme of this verse? What is the message? V'yadaita Yem, which means yadas, your mind. V'shavesa levavecha means in your heart. So here we see the mind contemplating, the heart, the emotions being stimulated and inspired and being awakened toward what? To know and to feel that the divine Havaya, which is higher, transcendence, bligvul, keser, hu alikim, is same and one with the divine as it gets concealed and enters into the immanence, into existence. That's Havaya alikim. B'shamayim emal v'oretz mitachas. Explains it in different ways, das elyon and das tachten, how we see it from the higher level, we see it in the lower level. Bottom line, it's all about joining together, but here it's already the language that even post-Tzimtzum, Elikim, also is ultimately one with Havaya. And there he introduces the next section, a whole arichas, where he talks about, to understand that well, he goes into explaining every word of the verse, V'yadaita hayoim. Hayoim is Yom and Laila, day and night, Tzimtzum and Gili. Oyer and Cheshach is Yom. So the Yom is not just today as in the present, but Yom means that that's part of the process. So Yom is also the theme of day and night. And Navoida, that's Rotze and Shuv, tension and resolution. And Navoida, that's Shabbos and the weekdays. Or the Aveda Sabirurim at Selikim. That's the work we do in this world. And Shabbos is a higher than Berurim, higher than refinement. And that's when he introduces man, that the man, which was produced on Shabbos, but fell every day, is also an interface. Because on one hand, it's pure divine energy. And the second, it manifests in some type of food, but it's lechem min hashamayim. The Berurim that we do throughout the week is lechem min haaretz, the work that we do in refining existence. There too, these two different dimensions. Again, interface. Then he leads that into the two levels of Yesh, Ayin, Yet, the Yesh, Ayin, and Yesh, and the Ayin divides into two. Also part of this interface, the Ayin of Yesh Amiti, the Ayin of the Yesh Nivra, explains that in many different ways. And with that he concludes more or less the volume 2 in Ayin Beis. In volume 3 is the concern, the last two words in the verse, what's the last two words? Einoid. Says, what does Einoid add? You already said Havaya Elakim. So we already have the fusion between Oyer and Gilui and Helam, Oyer and Cheshach, but we don't have one more thing. We have not accounted for. We've accounted that the darkness, its purpose is to be illuminated, and the light's purpose is to penetrate and transform the darkness. But what about the very fact that the darkness itself was created by God? So Einoid comes to teach us that the Cheshach itself is also a divine force, that the Helam itself, or in other words, the Rishimu, or the Kalim, and the Cheshach itself, or later we use the word Gvuras, it itself is also creation. And we want to make the interface so complete that you don't just create that the Kalim and the Cheshach allows the earth to travel through it, or even transform it, but it itself is also an expression of the divine. So essentially, Einoid means nothing but him. That includes also even the darkness itself is also an expression of godliness. Not just its purpose is to bring godliness, but it itself is godliness. And that's what a big theme that we've been discussing throughout this volume. But to explain that, the Rebbe Rashab went further into the interface of explaining how the maturity process that we grow from mutva, murgish, muskel, from a subjective human being, as we become more mature and we can interface and have a relationship with something greater than ourselves, with godliness, and to the highest level of it, that we become completely absorbed by the highest level, b'chol ma'idecha, the highest level of godliness, which is essentially the whole theme of mutva, murgish, muskel, from midas to moichen shebe midas, to murgish, mutva, murgish, and then muskel, where the midas elevate the moichen to gaze at and connect to what? Keser, the forehead and the glow of arich and atik. So there you have again Keser coming into play, and that's where you keep seeing this interface throughout Ayin Beis. In the process, this also came to explain the difference between Gan Eden and Elam Haba, the revelation, different levels of revelation, the ones that are fit into existence, like Gan Eden is the way God created existence, but then we create an Er Chadash, as we elevate the muskel to the highest levels, that's even more than what was created in the beginning. Gan Eden on its own was also producing beautiful fruit. But la'avda l'shabra, aveda, the aveda of a person, reaches even deeper and creates a whole new level of abundance. The Tosfos is the Er Chadash that we've been talking about. And that Er Chadash has the power to transform, not just to illuminate, but to transform. And in that transformation, we learned the three levels. One is it sweetens the waters, but does not transform, changes them, but does not transform them. The second, it transforms them, but it's from without, the chesed from the sweet waters. And the third, that the bitterness itself gets transformed from the kelama atzmi, from the koyach, where it originates from, the power of the divine that's concealed within it, that actually created this state of bitterness in the first place, and concealment, cheshech and gvuris and so on. Okay, so now to bring it back to where we are, so we've talked already about the third level of sweetening, and the Rebbe Rashab from there, he went in to discuss, to explain the third level of sweetening, he went to talk about, okay, so that's ultimately where tshuva comes into play. Why? Because now you're dealing with a darkness that is not being illuminated by oir, which would be like by a tzaddik. A tzaddik's nefesh alekis is so powerful, it ultimately transforms his animal soul, like he said, the Ava Rabba, the Ava B'Tainugim from Tanya chapter 9. But that's the nefesh alekis transforming the nefesh abamis. If you want it to be transformed from within, it has to be the animal soul, its distress, its darkness itself, its call, like he said, its deathly call, a call of death and desperation. That is the ultimate transformation from within. That's the ultimate tshuva. And like he explained, that's when your person hits rock bottom, like we discussed, and the darkness itself, without illuminating light. Because even though it's Yom Kippur, or like he spoke about the Shefer Gadol, but he called that a koyach nelam. It's a force, but it's concealed. It's not something we do. It's not like someone comes over to you, inspires you. It's a force that's embedded within the darkest places, that even in the deepest darkness, even a kal shebekalim, or a lost soul, like he said, Oivdim be'eretz asher, We spelled it out in very specific detail. He said the way that even they get awakened, but it's not awakening that is a revealed force. It's coming from a concealed place. And that is ultimately the deepest level of transformation. In Avodah, this is the level of tshuva, but not a tshuva that comes from the nefesh alikisa, awakening nefesh habamis, because that's the Ur awakening the darkness, and the Ur even transforming the darkness. But here it's coming from a place from within that the very darkness itself is getting transformed from internally. Now this leads us to Yud Gimel Midas Harachim, because what he said was on Yom Kippur, what is the power that does this? That there's the power of the Yud Gimel Midas Harachim, the 13 divine attributes of compassion that God revealed to Moshe Rabbeinu when Moshe begged for forgiveness on Har Sinai in the 80 days after they had built the golden calf. So the Yud Gimel Midas Harachim plays a central role here. And the Rebbe Rashab is now, we're in the middle of learning exactly about those Yud Gimel Midas Harachim and how they were revealed to Moshe. And you see, its revelation didn't come through revelation. It came through concealment. Now, Moshe was concealed. Hashem concealed him in the crevice within the rock. He says, you'll stand on the rock, on the mountain. I will make a crevice, a cavity within the rock where you will be concealed. And that's when the Yud Gimel Midas Harachim are revealed, because Yud Gimel Midas Harachim come from the Tzur. As he explained, Tzur is the Koyach HaNelam. It's concealed. It's like a flintstone. It has all the potential within it. It's the level of the Rishimu, or the level of Butzina de Kardanisa, the dark or hard flame, the dark energy, so to speak. And from that is the root Butzina de Kardanisa, which manifests in Gvura of Atik, which manifests in Meches Tema, from which is derived the 13 strands, Yud Gimel Tikkun Dikna, the 13 attributes of compassion. So the story actually tells us, why was he standing in this rock? The rock, Tzur, and the crevice within the rock all represent this level, which he also calls the Rishimu, as he explained, because the Rishimu, higher than Ur, so this is the place where actually the transformation will come from within. And we're in the middle of learning about that Yud Gimel Midas Harachim. What we learned so far is this, that we already came back already to the pasuk. So he spoke about, this began at the bottom of page 1333. Hine mokim iti. God says the space is iti, with me, or it's beside me. Iti is with me. No, I'm not within the space is within me. What is this space referring to? So he said this is the mokim of the Rishimu. It's the mokim, the chol pone, not like the pirush of the Emek HaMelech, that is the eagle hagadol that surrounds the space, the oyer, but it's actually the darkness of the space, which is the Rishimu. And that is where the Nitzavta Malatzur, the Nitzavta Alatzur is when it refers also to that level, the rock, which he explained is that same level. He doesn't say explicitly whether the mokim and the tzur is the same thing, but it sounds like the mokim is the space God created, and the tzur is the actual Rishimu. But he does say in both of them Rishimu. He says it's a tzur and mokim meitzeh eish. And that is the root of the Yud Gimel Midas Harachim. So then he asked the question on page 1334. So why are they called Rachamim? Yud Midas Harachim when they come from Gvura Savatik. Gvura is the opposite of Rachamim. Gvura is also tzimtzum. Rachamim is expansion. Rachamim pshutim. The whole point here is expansion of God's compassion to forgive even the harshest sins. So he explained that in Gvura there are two levels, two interpretations, which are opposites, but they're interdependent. And now we learned last class, we learned how they are interdependent. One is Take Gvura tzimtzum and concealment and limiting in human beings. That Isha Gvura is a very limited person, a severe, a harsh person, stingy person even. Whereas the other interpretation is the opposite, Tagberes Achayis, the intensity, Gvura as in the word power, force, strength, intensity. That's the exact opposite meaning. And that's what we're talking about here, that the Yud Gimel Harachim are coming from the Tagberes, the intensity that has the power even greater than Chesed, because Oyer is a revelation, but it has its definition and has its limitation. Gvura, I can explain the several different aspects of Gvura. Gvura has the power to go, to extend, like he said, like an animal, versus cattle. An aggressive animal is far more passionate, far more driven, far more powerful, and quicker and faster and everything, like he said. I think in the Maimorim of the Alter Rebbe, when he brings this things, he says three things. Zirizus, Ischalkus is the third thing, and that it comes lamata mata, I think. But bottom line is that Gevura represents speed, intensity, bringing it down all the way downward, that the flow goes all the way down, and it's incessant, it doesn't cease. And finally, one more thing Gevura does, it breaks it into details, but not through tzimtzum, but through intensity. That tagbeirus ha'atzmis, that's so powerful that it just breaks things into details. And all that is the source of Yud Gimel Midas Arachmim, which is Yud Gimel Midas, Medida, but like he explained, Medida Atzmis, a core Medida, not the Medida from Tzimtzum, but the Medida that comes that God himself is choosing to break it down, or the intensity of godliness is break it into details. That's what we learned on pages essentially 1334, 1335, 1336. Yeah. So Gvura, the Atik, therefore, is the true source of creation, because even though it comes from Chesed, Chesed is the flow, but Gvura gives it that intensity that it should come all the way downward and all the way down into details and into a breakdown of the spheres and so on. So therefore, also when it comes now to Yud Gimel Midas Arachmim, which also come down, even in a Mokum of Avinus, like he said, even when a person sinned, so you have the Gvuras of Atik that manifest the Meiches Tema. So they come down into Meiches Tema, which is the beginning of Atzilus. So it's again interfacing between Atik, Gvuras of Atik into Atzilus, and that's the Slichas Avinus, because the Gili is Beribui without Tzimtzum Amiyat, because it's coming from the intensity of Gvura. So it comes down even to forgive those that have transgressed. I'm reading the bottom of page 1337 now. Yeah, that's Gvura of Atik, which is higher than Chesed. But it does come down through Cyrus. It does come down through narrow channels, because it also has to come down specifically to the people who have transgressed, tailored to them, like he explained, but it's a Medida Atzmis. Good. So the end of this subject matter is on top of page 1338. He said, then this is Tzur, Putzina de Kardanisa, Gvura da Atik, that manifests in Meiches Tema. From there come the Yud Gimel Tikkun Dikna, and Vehirala Esemai de Shehit Minishmas, and God showed this to Moshe by hiding his neshama in Nikras Hatzur. As we explained, Nikras Hatzur is the crevice, the indentation, the cavity within the rock, which is like the level of the womb. Yesod Malchus, which is all the way Yesod Malchus of Ein Sof, which is connected to Yesod Ima, according to the Pardes, which is the second Ibur that we learned about. Okay. And this all comes from Tagberes Ha'atzmus, the level of Rishimu. Very good. So Moshe being hidden inside the crevice represents like the womb bittel, a clay reikon. That's what an empty space is like. When you make a crevice in the rock, you're creating a clay reikon, an empty space. That's where Moshe was to receive the Yud Gimel Midas Arachmim, which are rooted from Gvuras the Atik, which is the Helem of the Tzur, that it's all in a state coming from a state of Helem, not a state of Gili. But here Helem, that all the way Helem Ha'atzmi, this is coming Tagbeirus Ha'atzmis, not the Helem of Tzimtzum and limitation, but from intensity and power and strength and force, from the highest levels of the Tagbeirus Ha'atzmis. Okay. That's the end of the paragraph on page 1338. Now we began the next paragraph as well. Before I continue, I want to just stop if anybody wants to ask anything, since I gave this whole overview right now. But and so if anybody wants to clarify anything, please. And then I'm going to go back to this paragraph, but I have to give a longer introduction this time, and you'll see why in a few minutes. So just for if anybody wants to.
What's the difference between Tagboros Ha'atzmius and Tagboros Ha'chayis?
Tagboros Ha'chayis means intense energy. Tagboros Ha'atzmius means it's coming from the etzem, that intensity.
Which etzem?
In this case, Atzmus, the Eibishter, God's intensity.
Atzmus?
I don't know what you mean by Atzmus. Explain Atzmus.
It says built in Nimsa.
He doesn't say that here, so not necessarily, but it's definitely coming. There's the oir comes from, look, everything comes from Atzmus. Oir comes from Atzmus, and Helam Atzmi comes from Atzmus. But we learned that Chesed is a flow that's more of a limited flow coming from godliness. And when God conceals, it's coming from a more intense place. It's more of a, it requires more intensity, and it comes from a more intense level.
I have a question.
I explained at length, I believe. If you want more explanation, just for the record, by the way, which I didn't mention, if you go back in volume 1, chapter 159, Rebbe Rashab explains Tagberis Atzmis a little more in detail than he does here. But if you want to explain it here, look at this is essentially the lines in the pages where he talks about the whole point of Gvura being stronger than Chesed. Remember about animals and cattle, or the dam, the blood, or when a person's passionate. He gave maybe 5-6 examples of intensity that where Gvura comes from. And that intensity is the power. That's an Atzmizdika power that's more powerful than Chesed. Because Chesed has a flow that limits, and Gevura takes it all the way through, will push it through, that forward thrust. So here, yes, the Tagberis Atzmis is coming from an Atzmizdika place of godliness. Yeah.
I had a question.
I just want to follow up on that, Yitzhak, for a second. Does that mean that the Pnimis Atzmus is more connected to Gvura than Chesed? Because I always thought Tov, Tov Lahativ, that the essence of godliness is Chesed more than Gevura. Here it seems to be saying the opposite, that essentially Gevura is a stronger, more essential power of God. Is that? Did
you hear the classes that we learned, page 1334 and 1335? Will you hear those classes?
I'm not sure. I've been listening, yes, later, sometimes that night.
So basically in those 2 pages, he discussed this explicitly, not even implicitly, explicitly. He even brought Teva Tev Lahetiv. How do you like that? So he explained that Teva Tev Lahetiv is the reason God creates. It's Chesed, like he said on page 1337. He says like this. Look at these words. Hagam de Chesed Omer Yivra. That even though Chesed is the force of creation, because God's the love, the flow. Chesed the arich, like he says. He says the chemashpia gam ken chayis ki enke sheteva hatev lahetiv v'kol mokim b'chdei sheyeh yiridas ha'er ein sof lahavis hanevroim. In order for there to bring that energy of Chesed all the way down below, and in a structured form, you need Gvura. So it's not a contradiction. These are 2 forces that God is using. So there's concept that we have Chesed as in Gilui and Gvura as in Tzimtzum, where he needs to conceal. But there's another aspect of Gvura that we've been learning here, that it gives a forward thrust, that the water of Chesed and the creative force of Chesed and Toiv has a limit, and Gvura gives it that bli gvul and intensity. So that comes from a deeper dimension, like he said explicitly as well, that Gvuris is higher than Chsodim. On page 1336, I mean, this is exactly what we've been learning here. As a matter of fact, in the parentheses on 1336, he made it so clear that Oir and Chesed comes Hispashtus Ein Sof, and Kalim come from Atzmus Ein Sof. So this is all part of the discussion throughout this whole. I'm not saying anything new. It has been discussed, and you're asking exactly that. So I could repeat it, but I just said it briefly. But that's the Kudas Advarim, yeah. And I even went back to page 1267 where he explained it at length. We reviewed even sections from there. So this is essentially the theme here, yeah. Like the Rishimu, the root of the Kalim is higher than the root of the energy. Even though Oir is higher than Kalim in actuality, but the root of Kalim, to create the Keli, the Koyach HaHelam, comes from a deeper place than the Koyach HaGili. Like I explained, for a wise person to be quiet takes more energy and more restraint than the power to reveal. It demonstrates a deeper power within him, is among the different examples. Okay?
So wouldn't that imply that in the times of the Gula Shlema, Gevura, which is right, Shammai will run over Hillel? That's interesting. That in the times of the Gula Shlema, Gevura will be preeminent over Chesed.
This is the whole theme of the last 30 pages.
Right.
Okay.
Okay.
But I explained even that. What does that mean? That doesn't mean that won't have a role to play. We talked about it. We talked about the etzem within You even asked the question, doesn't have also tziyur in it? I gave a whole explanation how also has elements of etzem within it. And the kelim have etzem have elements of within them. It's not going to be it's not a competition between kelim and They're going to join together. Just a question. Each one reveals a different dimension. They both need each other. You have to always remember that. It's never going to be simplistic as one wins and the other one loses. They're both two forces of God that come together. And each one has something else to express and reveal.
But don't we say here that the power of Gevura is to push Chesed all the way down? It's got a strength to it that Chesed doesn't have.
So what do you mean? It doesn't have its own strength. It's God's strength. God has both strengths. Remember, comes from God and Gevura comes from God. So it's all one God choosing different tools he's using to achieve a bigger goal. Just keep that in mind always. It's not a competitive team here. They're both divine energies, and each one has their role to play in the big scheme of things. It's like we don't talk about neshama and guf, which is higher. They both have something the other doesn't have, and they both need each other. And remember, they don't think in terms of ego. This isn't like we think in terms of ego. Who wins? These are both divine forces that are doing what God wants them to do as both expressions. When we understand it, through both of them, we come to understand godliness in a deeper way. There's plenty of reasons we need and not just chesed, not just gvura. Here he's focusing after 1,335 pages. We talked a lot about the quality of He's now coming to the end of Ayin Beis. He's coming and explaining the power that's also within the kelim themselves. But remember, at the end of the day, we want chesed in our lives. We don't want gvura in our lives.
That's what I mean. I'm getting nervous. Right.
That's why I'm not understanding. It seems to me, I mean, it's not critique. You're like missing the whole point of what we're learning here then. You keep asking me this. I mean, this is the whole theme. And I just gave a whole overview of it. It's not one or the other. It's not a competition. It's not whether you're going to eat a steak or chicken. These are two forces of the divine that are all complement each other and need each other. And together they give us a clearer picture and experience of Elikus in all part levels. It's like saying, what's higher, Torah and mitzvahs? We don't speak in that way. Each one has something the other doesn't have, and they both complement each other. What's higher, a tzaddik or a Baal Tshuva? Even when you say a Baal Tshuva has quality over a tzaddik, doesn't mean a tzaddik doesn't have any qualities. Let's make that clear. So it's not like once you hit Tshuva, you don't need tzaddikim. We're going to be learning about that as well. Okay.
Okay.
Can I ask you a question now?
Yeah.
So first, I wanted to thank you for the overview. It was amazing, and I'm going to be listening to it a couple times over. So I'm sure everybody appreciates that you did that, especially for someone like me who came on later in the class. That overview from the beginning until we are here to show the flow was very helpful. So thank you. Okay. My question is, like where we're holding right now, this and to understand why Tagboris ha'atzmius, when Gvura expresses itself with that intensity, it comes out, but he's chalkus. What is it about that power that makes that which is below it, it's the Nivraim, if you will, or the lower levels of Elikus, the lowest being Nivraim. Why is it coming out staccato? It's a musical term that keeps coming in, into my mind. Like that. What is it? If you think about strength, I don't know, just intuitively, it's almost like waving the magic wand. I'm so powerful, Superman. I can just deliver it all. I guess I don't. Maybe it's because if it comes down that way, it's destructive. But that part's been bothering me and a couple other students in the class. So if you could answer that.
Okay, I thought I did, but I'll say this. So first of all, simply physically speaking, when you strike something very hard, you see it shatters much more details than when you don't. So you see from there that a koyach chazak, gvura, simply expresses itself not just in intensity, like when you strike something very powerful, the sparks start flying. So that's just the way it is in nature, which tells you that intensity has that power to break things into parts. In context of the divine picture, remember, God wants to have both achdus, unity, but he also wants a structure. So if you only had chesed, the flow of chesed, like he said at the bottom of page 1335, he says, chesed flows like mayim, kulam ka'achas. And that's a quality, actually, the quality of unity. It's one flow. But God also wants a breakdown. So Eir Ein Sof Lifnei Tzimtzum, in the words of the Arizal, is actually Eir Ein Sof Poshet B'tachlis Apshitus. Poshet B'tachlis Apshitus means seamlessness, oneness, singularity, like a field of energy. But God, the artist, wants to envision a particular structure. He wants 10 spheres. He doesn't want seamlessness. He wants, in the diversity of existence, he wants us to experience seamlessness, Hashem Echad. But he wants it in Echad, in the Ches and the Dalet of 7 heavens and earth and Dalet Ruches, east, west, north, and south, the structure of existence. So the question is, where does that come from? If Eir is the force of a unified energy and a seamless energy, where does the Chalkos come from? So that we say comes from a deeper power within God, the Koyach HaGvura, Tagberes HaAtzmi. Like he said very explicitly on page 1337, he said, this Chalkos of the spheres. So if God was pure unity, you'd say, you know what? He just has seamless, infinite possibilities of creating art, but he wants one piece of art. So where's that coming from? Tzimtzum is not the power of Eir. The tzimtzum has to come from something deeper, and that's God's capacity to break it into details. That's called an intensity, where he overpowers the oneness of the seamless unity of chesed to bring in details into it. But this is not coming from concealment and limitation like Gvura in the lower interpretation. It's coming from Tagberes Medida Atzmis, like he explained at the bottom of 1336, what that means. And I also referred you now to chapter 159, where he speaks about it as well, a little more in detail. So that's the bottom line.
Thank you. I'm sure you did explain it. I just didn't get it. This is pretty thick stuff.
Fine. It's fine. It's perfectly fine. It's a lot of details here. There are a lot of dimensions. I have no problem repeating myself. I'm just, when I say that I said it already, it's not like I said to Eliezer before too. It doesn't mean that I won't repeat. I just want to know if what I said was completely not heard, or it wasn't understood, or there's just so much going on, you can get lost in the woods here, which is, I've said, you need to learn this hundreds of times, to be very honest. It's very complex. There are certain basics here, but it's still complex. It's going to get more complex. Trust me, this Shabbos, I had to struggle big time to understand the next section.
Wow.
Very confusing, the next section.
Well, that was helpful.
I think I figured it out, but that's what I want to do next. So,
okay, well, without further ado,
unless somebody has other questions. Look, I'd be surprised if anybody got this completely, to be honest. There's so much going on here. And the more you delve into it, it sounds so certain things are so counterintuitive. Like Eliezer's question is very real. We're always used, and I even stated it very clear in the last classes. We're used to always hearing the opposite, that Eir is bli gvul and Gvura is gvul. That's how we're so accustomed. So suddenly you hear the opposite, you start saying, 1 second, what's going on here? But it's not a contradiction, as we've been explaining. So there's a whole, everything turns over, but then you get it clear. You'll start seeing how it all comes together, I have referred, I'll just say one more thing before I continue here. I've referred you a few times to the Sikha in Chelik Tazayin, Lekut Sichos, volume 16. There's a Siyum and Masechta Chagiga in the Sikha there on Vayakel. Vayakel, Truma Vayakel. I think it's Truma and Vayakel, if I recall correctly, or Pekudet. Regardless, it's just a very clear what he says. Just it's in different language, but the same idea. We talk about what's higher, Torah or mitzvahs. It's another way of saying Torah or the kalim of mitzvahs. So everybody knows, on one hand, you say Torah is higher. Everything comes from Torah. Even mitzvahs come through Torah. On the other hand, the Torah is learning, it's Oyer. And the mitzvahs actually take a physical object and transform it. So it's more like the transformation of existence. Besides the mitzvah of limudat Torah, which is still with the mind, but you take a physical object, you take tzitzis or tefillin, you're taking a physical thing, you're transforming it. So Chassidus explains, and the Rebbe brings there, the same question is asked, what's greater, the Oyer or Yesh? Is Atzilus higher than Asiya? So for sure, Atzilus is Alakus. It's a world that's completely divine. A neshama of Atzilus is higher than a neshama of Asiya. But still we say in the Yesh of Asiya, there's something that Atzilus doesn't have. The Koyach Atzmus. So how do you explain that? Which is higher? So the answer is, in Giluyim, in revelation, in divine expression, of course Atzilus is higher. Like we say, Yofer Shah Achas, Shal Keiras Ruach, Ba'elam Haba, Mekol Chai Elam Haz. The pleasure of 1 hour in Elam Haba is greater than all the pleasures of this world. But then we say, Yofer Shah Achas, B'tshuva Maisim Tevim Ba'elam Haz, Mekol Chai Elam Haba. How do you reconcile that? Because one is talking about Nachas Ruach, Boire. Where's the Eibers to have more Nachas Ruach? Where is the Kavona? Is in the Yesh, in Elam Haza. So 1 hour of Aveda here is worth more than all the pleasures in the world to come. But if you're talking about Nachas Ruach Nivra, our pleasure, our revelation, 1 hour revelation Elam Haba far outweighs all the revelations in this world. And we want both. We want to have the Etzem, which comes through the Yesh, but we want it Begili. That's why we pray for Mashiach. Because if that's not the case, you could say, you know what? God has much more pleasure when we're in Golus, in a concealed state, and we're Mesiras Nefesh, because that's where the biggest challenges are. When Mashiach comes, there won't be a challenge like that. Like the Frierdiker Rebbe says, that Mashiach comes, we'll yearn for the days of Golus. But the Rebbe explains in Vayigash, Chelik Hey, and other places that no, the Eibster, if it remains concealed, it's also a limitation. So ultimately, the answer is Torah reveals even the power of the Yesh. That's why a Baal Tshuva could be higher than a Tzaddik. But who reveals it to the Baal Tshuva? That itself is revealed through the Tzaddik and through Torah. Because without Oyer, we wouldn't know that the Yesh has this quality. Because we wouldn't learn Chassidus, we wouldn't know it. Awareness is Gilui. So even the awareness of the quality of Helam over Gilui is also coming through Gilui. So everything has to come through Oyer. Even the power of Yesh, that's higher than Oyer. And at the same time, Oyer has the Maila that it reveals it to us. It's not just by faith or stays in a concealed state. But if you talk about the pure power, the pure firepower of Yeshus and of Helam, it's far deeper there. But that doesn't mean we want it to stay concealed. That's why the Kavanah is the Gilui of Helam Atzmi, not just Helam Atzmi. And at the end of the day, the Oyer and the Helam both come from Atzmus, like I said, and they both need each other, and they both interact with each other, and they both are dependent on one another. Now, there's a lot more to be said on this. This is a big topic in Chassidus, but I just wanted to give it there. You can look up those sikhs I mentioned to get more on this. And I have talked about it quite a few times, not just in this class, in many classes, but it comes to explain a lot of different things, like, what's higher, the body or the soul, Yaakov or Esav, the animal soul, the divine soul. So it all depends what you're talking about and what role each one plays, but they all need each other. Like you have to ask yourself, why only L'asad Lavi is Gvur is going to go higher than Chsadim? If it's higher, why isn't it higher now? Why do we have to wait till the future? because you need chsadim to help the guide and direct and reveal that Ma'ila and Gvura. It doesn't come on its own. So you see that there's a twist to everything here. So everything needs each other, and that constantly a symbiotic process. So I hope that helped a bit more. Okay.
That was very powerful what you said just now, that you need the oil to reveal and understand what Gvura is doing for us.
Yeah. Yes, indeed. Okay. You ready to enter the next stage of the fray?
Let's go for it.
Okay. So we began the last year. The next part of this is discussion is the pasuk. So we talked about Nikras Tzur, Nikras Atzur, where Hashem places V'samticha, I will place you, Moshe, in the cavity, in the crevice, in the rock. So we learned what that is. And that's where Hitmin, he showed him the Yud Gimel Tzarachmin by hiding his soul inside of the crevice, the womb, the cavity in the rock. Okay. But then it continues, the pasuk says, the pasuk before that says like this, that you will stand, the pasuk goes like this, we've read it before. Then the pasuk continues, and when my covet will pass by, I will place you in this cavity in the rock. So the question is, what is the Haya Ba'aver Kvedi? What is that exactly? So we began learning it and talked about covet being Malchus. And Ba'aver Kvedi is referring to Malchus, we see, is an integral, covet rather, is an integral piece of Malchus. Melech Shamochel al Kvede and Kvede Mochel. They're intricately bound. A melech without covet is not a melech, basically. So essentially, covet, and that's why when an eved, like he said, fulfills the desire and the commands of the king, like he said, that causes a deeper satisfaction and a flow of energy inside the heart of the king. And the same, the opposite. When he shows disrespect, heder HaKavod, and does not honor him, and does not fulfill his command desire, that causes a certain giroyin, to the point that he can get angry and upset. And the same thing, lamaila, our mitzvahs, our zochias, our merits, bring nachas to the Eibishter. Teis v'ser b'midas ha'malchus da'atzilus. That's covet hamelech. Like, that's ata yigdol no koyach adnai, shemisifim koyach begvura shamayla. And the same, the opposite, when a person, God forbid, sins, weaken kavyochel, and somewhat weaken and cause a giroyin, a diminishment in the divine, in the malchus of the Eibush. But then he began to explain that it's not a giroyin amiti, chaz v'shal. You can't say it's a true diminishment. And that's where we learned, and we discussed it, and I'm going to go over it. But I wanted to really review it myself first. So I went back to understand, what is he saying? Why is it not a Giroyin Amit? I started reading it. I'll just tell you exactly the process that happened. I got very confused. So I decided to go back to the mimer that this is based on. Kibiyem Hazeh Yechaper, the beer of Kibiyem Hazeh Yechaper, that is printed in the Eiratet of Yom Kippur that I posted, which is really a reprint, or at least not exactly a reprint, but the same mimer as in Derech Mitzvah Chelik Beis, which is all a mimer of Tovkov Samach Beis, the beer on the mimer Lekutei Torah Achrei that he cited earlier on page 1334, and as well as on page 1337. So the Rebbe Rashab has given us the citations. So I look in that mimer, and actually that mimer, I realize that what it says here, first initially it seems to contradict what it says there. Now, I'm telling you exactly what happened. So I'm looking at the words here, and I'm looking at the mimer, and I see that there's one letter that in the original Derech Mitzvah Secha is missing. And the Tavkuf Samach Beis, it's not there. And when you that letter that is printed, which I first thought was a typo, is actually a basis of something the Rebbe Rashab understands differently than when you read that Maimer on your own. So then I came to realize that Rebbe Rashab actually knows how to read the Maimer better than all of us. I mean, I didn't have a consideration otherwise, but I was first confused. And then I came to realize that he's actually teaching us a pshat in the Maimer that you would not come to on your own. And when you go back to the Maimer of the Alter Rebbe and the Tzemach Tzedek, you realize the Rebbe Rashab's depth. I haven't seen this very often, but it happens from time to time. When you learn a Maimer, you see the Rebbe Rashab, the way he's explaining it is different than you would learn it on your own. So I'll share with you my findings, and then we can learn it inside. But without it, it's going to be very difficult to understand Pshat here in Ayin Beis, because the confusion first began by simply learning Ayin Beis. I thought to myself, if we learn it inside on our own right now, we're all going to have the same confusion because he seems to contradict himself here. So let me point out exactly what's going on here. I know this sounds a little cryptic, but I just wanted to give you what has transpired in the last day, at least in my review of all of this. Okay, now, when you learn the Maimer in Tavkuf Samach Beis, Tzemach Tzedek, and the Tzemach Tzedek's, it really cites that Maimer with additions, it seems quite clear what goes on. It seems like, at least ostensibly, that the Pshat is like this. After explaining the meaning of God placing him in the Nikr Satsur, in the cavity, in the crevice, in the rock, that's Gvuris of Atik. That he said, Nelam is God, that is the level of, you say Malchus of Ein Sof, Sinid de Kadenis and all of that. So now he comes and says, Kovid is Malchus. In Malchus, on its own, you could have a pagam. If a person defies God, when the Jews built the golden calf, for example, they caused kavyachol, so to speak, matishin gvurashe shalmayla. They dishonored God, they disrespected him, and what it causes, just like in the Moshel, it causes the king to be more crestfallen and more despondent. So kavyachol lamayla in Midas and in Malchus. We're not talking about in Atzmus now. We're talking about in the Spheres. Did the opposite. Kovid Melech elevates Malchus and the Midas, like he said. Schias. But when it comes to dishonoring God, what does an Aveda do? It weakens so-called the Gilui Elokus within Midas and Malchus. That's exactly what he says here. So what's the Baver Kvedi? The Pshat Baver Kvedi seems to be that Baver means, even though Baver means when the Kovid will pass, but he's really referring that the Kovid was so-called blemished. The Kovid was infringed upon because Kovid HaMelech was disgraced by their behavior. So the Maimer says there, so then when Malchus, so what changes? So Malchus on its own, that's where there'll be Echsarden, but Baver Kvedi, and then Malchus will elevate up to Gvuris of Atik, where the Yud Gimel Midas Arachim are there. Yud Gimel Midas Arachim are higher than this blemish, and they forgive. They override the Kovid, Hamelech, basically. So in Malchus and in the Midas of Atzilus and Zah, there you can have a Chsar. But Yud Gimel Midas Arachim comes from Gvuris of Atik, higher than in Keser, in the Pnimius, in the deepest levels, in that concealed place, that's higher than the blemish, and therefore it overrides. And that's the meaning what's going on here. That's when you learn the Maimer in Tavkuf Samach Beis, that's what it appears to sound like. Now, that and it makes sense because that's the Pshat here then. So fine, so that's the addition of Baver Kvedi. But when the Rebbe Rashab begins to explain it, he starts talking about that there's two different levels. There's Yud Gimel Midas Harachimim and there's the Tzur. If we read it inside, you'll see that he talks about it in ways that the Yud Gimel Midas Harachimim, he says, is like before you made the king angry. And then the Gili of the Tzur is after the king was angry, and now he's being, what do you call it? When you after so you're pacifying him. So like there's two levels here. So I got confused because the Yud Gimel Midas Harachimim seemed to be only a result of the sin. But apparently, the Rebbe Rashab is going to be explaining here that Yud Gimel Sarachim have two levels. There's the level of Yud Gimel Sarachim, like for a tzaddik, for example. Moshe Rabbeinu was not there by Chet Egel. Did he have a Gilui of Yud Gimel Midas Sarachim? Absolutely. So what effect does it have on him? He didn't sin. So you have to say that he has Yud Gimel Midas Sarachim in a pure way. That's just the intensity of Gurus of Atik that have nothing to do with sin. Whereas the Jewish people who sinned, their Yud Gimel Midas Sarachim is coming to pacify an angry God, so to speak, or an angry king. In other words, coming to repair the damage done. And that is not clear in the Maimer from the Alter Rebbe or the Tzemach Tzedek, these two elements. But when you read it in Ayin Beis, it's very clear that he's saying these two things. And when you go back to that Maimer, you start understanding the Pshat and the Maimer differently. I don't know how much to go in depth and really read that Maimer and this Maimer, because it can get a little dense. But this is part of what I came to discover through all of this. So bottom line is, what we're going to be learning here is that in Yud Gimel Midas Sarachim, there's both aspects. There's like the covet of the king, and then it's something that is very powerful, because when you do what the God wants, you increase in his covet, in his malchus, in his midas, and so on. Then there's disgracing the king or dishonoring the king, and you cause a diminishment. So let me now go back to this diminishment and explain it inside. Now, if what I said now was not understood, what shall I tell you? I think we'll understand it when we learn it inside. And maybe after we do, I'll go back to the Maimer from the Alter Rebbe or the Tzemach Tzedek and learn it there so you can see the comparison. But when you do compare the two, it can get initially quite, it's not so clear what's going on exactly. Now, I think also with Aver Kvedi, I was also struggling with that, because the Pashtus, Aver Kvedi, sounds like God's covet will pass by. That's what Aver means. Not Aver from like Havara. Havara means when you transgress. Avera comes from the word Havara. So but it seems that the Pshat here, Aver, is teaching it that when you disgrace the covet, Aver Kvedi, when my covet will be passed over. Not that the covet is passed away, because when you learn the pasuk, it sounds like the covet is the Yud Gimel Midas Sarachim. When God's covet will pass by, I will then but then what's the pshat that v'samticha, and then he goes on and says v'seresi, that he puts his hand to cover the face. So Rashi teaches there. Why? Because when this happens, it says the mechablim, the negative forces, also have the power over Moshe, so he had to be protected. What does that mean? If God is revealing covet and Yud Gimel Midas Sarachim, why does Moshe have to be protected? Why is there negative forces? Because clearly we're talking about that the Aver Kvedi is connected to what happened, that there is a Kpeda in heaven because the Jews had built a golden calf. So there's a dangerous moment until the Yud Gimel Midas Sarachim actually come in and are invoked to protect. So I'm still looking into that, but I did find another Maimer from the Reb Marash, Tofrei Lamed, which is based on these same Amorim, where he says clearly Aver Kvedi, he says, means Ein Koved El Teira, and that the Teira was over. They were over on the Teira, which means they disgraced it or they transgressed. So it sounds like, even though I'm still looking explicitly by Aver Kvedi, what Aver means, Aver Kvedi. Just pointing this out as well. I may need some help. If you guys find some research on this, I'm still looking into what Aver Kvedi actually means. Does anyone actually type that means that the covet was transgressed, not the covet is passing by? One more thing I want to say before we read inside. Let me just see something. In the Maimer of the Alter Rebbe and the Tzemach Tzedek, he also brings two interpretations of Aver Kvedi, and the Rebbe Rashab does not bring them. One, he says Mamayla Lamata, and one is Mamata Lamayla. He says like this. I'll just read it inside, so you'll see the language. Very interesting. He says like this. By Aver Kvedi, he says, Sheyistalik b'chinas malchus lemekere ozay tuchal liris hayud gimel midas sarachimim. When malchus expires and goes up into its source, that's when you can see the Yud Gimel Midas Sarachim, that's Aver Kvedi. Oya shleimer behepach, ba'aver Kvedi malmayla lamata. Upirish Kvedi ubchinas malchus the Ein Sof, V'ubchinas tachtena shebamaitzel, hamamshich b'chinas gvuras da'ati kemen. U'lechein nikru kvei atzmi. There, baver kvei actually means in a positive way, not malchus going up, but malchus coming down from malchus of Ein Sof, and that's where the Yud Gimel Midas Harachmim come from. And that's what he says, so I'm still, I can't say I have it all figured out, but it's getting clearer to me. And yeah. So I'm going to read now inside. Before we read inside, let me explain what we're going to say now. He says like this. So is there a Geroyin? We know when the servant disrespects or does not honor the king and does not fulfill his command, he said clearly it causes Geroyin Chayes Belev, a diminishment in his basically dissatisfaction, a diminishment, and to the point he gets angry. Said the same thing, Lamaila, sins, Matishin Kavyachal V'Geirim Geroyin. They weaken, so to speak, godliness. Now remember, this is godliness as it manifests in the spheres, in Malchus and Midas. Then he says it's not a Geroyin Amiti. Let me explain this before we read it inside. Why is it not a true Geroyin? Because why is it weakening his spirit? It's because God, or the Melech, is a very powerful king. He has great honor. Honor is part of his essence. We said it's an integral, it's intricately bound to the king. So why is he becoming stronger when you honor him? Because you're revealing his glory, his greatness, his majesty. And when you don't, when you dishonor, you're doing the opposite. So it's not coming because you're actually weakening him. It's because of he's such a powerful king and so much powerful covet. So when you don't do it, what you're doing is you're actually demonstrating that intensity that he has. However, right now it's concealed. So it's not a true Geroyin. That's essentially what the Alter Rebbe says. I'm going to use that actual language from the Maimer. He says like this. So in other words, if the person was a weak person and you dishonor him, so then, yes, you bring him down a level. But because he's so powerful, his honor is so powerful, and that's why you're bringing him down, it's not because you actually weakened him, it's because you're not experiencing, you're not honoring the honor that he deserves. So it's really coming, like what he said before, from Tagberis, from a very more intense place. However, right now it's intense in the anger that you've caused, but that's because he's a great person. In other words, when you insult a great person, the insult is deeper than when you insult someone that's not so great. Precisely because he's great. That's what the Alter Rebbe says. So therefore, it's not a Geroyin Amiti because it's actually an expression of his greatness that you have now disgraced. You follow what he's saying here? I know it sounds like a very interesting twist, but that's the pshat here. I want to read it inside. So he says like this. He says, why is it not a Geroyin Amiti? I'm reading from the Maimer of the Alter Rebbe right now. You can follow. It's on page 2134 in the Eira Teira by Yom Kippur. Because wherever there's more intensity, more vitality in the blood of the person, that's where it'll cause him to be angrier. When he doesn't get what he wants. So in other words, it's because of his great power, that's why he's angrier. Because anger comes from the blood, from the fiery, from the retichas, the heated. Retich is like cooking, the boiling blood. And wherever there's more blood, there's going to be more boiling blood. The more heat, there'll be more heat. So in other words, for example, something that's hotter is going to bubble more than something that's cooler. So why is it that he's getting angrier? Not because he's a weaker person, because he's a greater person. That's so far. Umavur b'moshel hanal, sha'adam hu ha'nefesh. The dam is coming from the nefesh, from a positive place. V'ikar ha'chayis nimtza, v'ikar ha'nefesh v'ikar ha'chayis, and that's the primary energy. Nimtze moving shekol ma sheyeh yeser kas behepach harotzen. So from this we understand wherever there's more anger, when you defy his will, there'll always be more energy when you fulfill his will. In other words, the bottom line, it's interdependent. Because there's so much power there, when you fulfill the will, there's going to be much more vitality. When you defy him, there's going to be much more anger. So it's coming from the same place, from a very strong place. That's what he says here. Before he made him angry, before he made him angry, the ikar achayis is his blood. That's why an animal is called chaya, because it's very much alive and very, very much more aggressive and much stronger than a cattle. No, 1 second. Let me just read. I think there's a mistake here, typo. Give me a second. And for that same reason, when you provoke an animal, it's going to be a lot more angrier. And then when you provoke something that's a more docile creature. So you see what's going on here. The same strength that caused him to be so passionate is also the strength that caused him to be so angry. That's essentially what he's saying. So there's a mistake. There's a typo here. I'm still reading from the Alter Rebbe, the Tzemach Tzedek's Maimer. According to this moshel, Yuvan she'en geroyin amiti. So from this we understand that you're not really causing a true diminishment in God b'sibas ha'avenes due to the sins. What you're only doing is revealing how much you've so-called what's the word I want to use? How you defiled God's powerful covet. That's what's revealed. So therefore he says it's not a Gedoyin Amiti, because that's what's happening. That's why when the Yud Gimel Midas Sarachimim are revealed after a sin, it's going to have so much more power, because it's revealing the power of the covet of the king. That's how he's interpreting it here. Does everybody get what I'm saying, or need more explanation?
It's not very clear to me. Why is it not a Gedoyin Amiti?
Yeah.
In a way, you would think it's the opposite. A greater king, if he's really truly great, he really doesn't care about the covet from a lower person, because he's not spoiled by it. He's not bothered by it. He knows his greatness. It's somebody,
No, remember, we're not talking about the level of Keser. That's correct in the level of Keser. But remember, there's the level how the king is ruling his government. So if somebody embarrasses the king in public, for example, even if in his inner etzem, he's not affected by it because he's higher than it, like you just said, and that's true, but his ability to govern has been compromised because he's been insulted or embarrassed in front of. So basically his level of midas, and remember the Geroyin is in midas and malchus of Zoh of Atzilus, not in Keser of Atzilus. That's the key thing to remember. So the king is going to stand up for his covet. It's going to, because that's where you affected him. But it's not a Geroyin Amiti. It's not a Geroyin Amiti because the fact of the matter is, it's all coming because of his greatness, not because of his. It's not coming out of insecurity. Let's put it this way: it's coming because he's so great. That's why you could say, why is Chil Hashem such a big sin? Why does God care? God cares whether you desecrated his name. He's above it all, because of his greatness, and you desecrate it in front of people. So therefore, the intensity of the sin is so much deeper. That's the point. We're not talking about whether he personally needs therapy for it or whether he himself has been hurt. Of course, God is removed and the Melech is also removed. But there's a part of him that you've now done extreme damage. That's why Chil Hashem is such a big sin. Because the damage in the eyes of the people, in other words, how the king relates to the people, there is great damage, but it's coming from his strength, not because he's insecure. Like, in other words, you could see a king who's an insecure king, you insulted him, and he takes your head. God forbid, he beheads the person simply because he's insecure. And you just simply, you hurt his feelings. Here, we're talking about, no, his covet is such a powerful covet that needs to be upheld. That's why Ein Kvei De Machal. Why king can't forgive? If a king could say, you know what? I don't mind that I was insulted. Big thing. I forgive him. The halacha is Ein Kvei De Machal. Because Malchus must have honor. You know, I'll just tell a story about it. There was a chassid, without names. The Rebbe wanted him to go somewhere and be on shlichus. Actually, he was on a shlichus, and then he decided he wants to come back. And the Rebbe wanted him to go back to his shlichus. He didn't want to go. So it was by a farbrengen, by Kosher Brocha, the Rebbe gave him a bottle of mashke and said to him, this is for your shlichus to go back. He didn't take it in public. He didn't want to take it because he didn't want to go back. And the Rebbe took the bottle and threw it down on the floor in front of everyone. So it was quite a scene you could imagine. And this chassid for many years was like blacklisted. The Rebbe wouldn't answer his l'chaims. He didn't go back. And people, of course, you can imagine, especially those that like a little gvura, made sure to make his life miserable, and so on. Okay. Years later, the Rebbe said l'chaim to him and, so to speak, maybe forgave him or whatever it was. Okay, so you could say why the Rebbe was such a the Rebbe couldn't oversee. The Rebbe didn't understand. It's difficult for him. Why would the Rebbe get upset like that visibly and throw the bottle down and not say l'chaim to him? The Rebbe's above that. The Rebbe forgave a lot big worse sins to people. People went by the Rebbe. People that we know did things that were, everyone that went to Yechidus was by the Rebbe was a tzaddik. So why is the Rebbe not makpid? So I heard years later, that this chassid's friend was Rapinya Altes. He was the chassid, a famous chassid in Eretz Yisrael. He was one of the Rebbe's representatives in Israel. He came from Nikolaev, the Rebbe's city. He was like a Karev close to the Rebbe's house, Rebbe's family and home. I think Rapinya Altes' brother or uncle, Shmuel Betzal, was the one that wrote up the whole diary around the Rebbe's wedding. Anyway, regardless, I heard Pinya Altes tell this chassid something which I thought was mind-blowing. He said to him like this. He says, a Rebbe doesn't have an army, and a Rebbe doesn't have money, and he doesn't have any power. His only power is his words. Those that listen to him. That's the only thing he has. If you don't listen to the Rebbe, then basically you're taking away all his power, because he doesn't have any other power. He's not controlling people with money or jobs or fear. It's purely because people listen, because he's the Melech, and you listen to the Melech. You take away that, you're basically undermining the whole Rebbe. So he told him, you should just simply go back to your Mokum HaShlichus, stay there a few weeks, and then come back under the radar. You should have taken the bottle. You can't do that to the Rebbe in public. Then the whole power of the Rebbe is people listening to him. You don't listen to the Rebbe, defy him in public. It's not whether you're affecting him. The Rebbe doesn't need you, but you're affecting his ability to be a Rebbe. So I thought it was a very Chassidish insight and powerful one. And I want to apply it here. So the point here is not that the Melech has been, you hurt his feelings. You insulted him. Ein Kvei De Machal is a halacha. Even if the king is the greatest king on earth and he doesn't care. He says, so I was insulted. I'm bigger than that. It doesn't bother me. And he truly doesn't bother him. The halacha is Ein Kvei De Machal, because it's not your covet to forgive. It's God's covet. You're a king because I put you here as king. It's not you. David HaMelech is bottled to the Eibishter. A true Melech is not about him. Tzemach Tzedek explains in Derech Mitzvah, Melech is only because God put him there. That's why Moshe is the honor. If someone insulted Moshe, it makes no difference if Moshe forgives him. But if he's insulting God, then it makes a difference. So the point being here is that what he's saying here is a few things. That first of all, we're not talking about the king be'etzem But etzem, as we'll learn, the Yud Gimel Midas Harachim, best proof that he could forgive. And we'll soon learn that this is a place that's even higher than Averis. Nothing is tefus makom there. It doesn't bother him, like you said. But that's the etzem of the king. That's not his pashtus HaMalchus in Midas and in Malchus of Atzilus. There, the king is actively serving as king. There, ain't kvei machal. You can't overlook it because it affects his ability to be a king. And therefore, there's a geroyin in his Malchus. But the Alter Rebbe is saying, or the Maimer is saying, all these Mamorim, it's not a geroyin amiti. It's not like you really damaged him. It's not fundamentally damaged because the only reason is because he's a king and because he's so powerful. That's why his anger is so powerful, because it's coming from a very great place, not from a weak place. And that's the point. So it's not really a geroyin, it's actually a powerful place. And that's why when forgiveness is achieved, it's also coming from a very powerful place. That's more or less what this says in this Maimorim here. At least my understanding of it. As I said, it's when you read it, you have to go over it again and again. I first read it in Ayin Beis. In Ayin Beis, I was confused, so that's why I went back to the Maimorim and the source. And this is what I'm trying to derive from it. I want to read it inside with you guys. And let's see. I think this is the way the pshat is. Is that clear?
It's very clear to me now. With the pogrom is in Zah and Malchus of Atzilus, not in his.
Yeah. No, that's explicit. That is going to say that's like explicit here. The problem is that there's some nuances here that are. Let me read it inside an Ayin Beis now. He says, Omnam, I'm reading the line that says, Omnam ein zeh geroyin amiti chas v'sholom. It's on page 1338. So he says, it's not a true geroyin, even though we just said it weakens the king, so to speak, a sin, weakens gvuroshe, was a gerim geroyin, matishin. Shahari, why is it not a geroyin amiti, God forbid? Shahari, al derech moshel hakas, hu magvura shebedam. Example, when anger, where does anger come from? It comes from the gvuras in the blood, the severity, the intensity. In other words, basically a cool and aloof person that's detached doesn't get angry, not for good reason necessarily, but he's there, he's detached. But someone that has a hot-blooded person will get anger. And the more vitality and energy he has in his blood, the more hot-blooded he is, basically. That'll cause his anger to get more. When he doesn't get what he desires, when he doesn't acquire, he doesn't get what he wants. This is the words that we just read before as well. Because anger comes from the fire, from the bubbly, what did I say? The bubbly, the cooking, the boiling, I should say, not cooking. But it is like the how did I just translate it? I just said it myself, forgot my own word I used. Okay. Not boiling.
Boiling blood.
The boiling blood, yeah. And that comes from the element of fire in the heart, like he says in Tanya. In Tanya, the end of chapter 1. We reviewed this. I'm just going to do this quickly. There he says, because Eish goes upward as anger does. But here he's focusing more on the fiery element, on the boiling element. It explains the deeper meaning in that. Okay. And the more blood there is, meaning the more fiery, the more boiling blood. The more blood there is, the more boiling, the more boiling there'll be. And here again, he reconciles the two elements in Gvura. V'zehu, the Beis Yanim shebegvura hein habaha talya canal. Like we said before on page 1334, the two elements of Gvura are interdependent, which the intensity and power of Gvura, and also its tzimtzum. So now we understand why, because it's actually the tzimtzum, like he says here, the b'chinas Gvura v'dinin which is like anger, the judgments and the severities, or the severities and judgments, is in a state of intensity and strength. So in other words, that's why it's connected. We said earlier that the gvura, that is like a limited gvura, where a person is an angry, severe person, is actually coming, the more intense he is, and the more power he has, the more angry he'll be. So it's interdependent, and that explains what we are learning, even though it seems like an aside, but this goes back to transforming the gvura from within, which means even the darkest gvura below is rooted in the highest gvura above, which is intensity. But let's continue to explain why is it not a giroyin. Like we see an animal, what he means here is a wild animal, aggressive animal, not docile cattle, has more kas and tzikha, more anger and violence, or the tzikha even is murder, the tzikha more vicious power, or killing strength, much more than an animal. Not because it's weaker, because it's stronger. Because it has more blood, it's more hot-blooded, much more energy in it. This is coming not because it's like, you say like a child, for example, is, I'm going to learn this also later. A child gets angry very quickly because a child doesn't have moichin. So it's easy to overwhelm a child's faculties, emotions, and the child starts crying easily and gets upset. They'll also be pacified easily. But an adult has moichin, so just because somebody insulted you, you don't start crying. You don't start getting angry. What he's saying here is that the anger is not coming from a place of immaturity. It's coming from a place of intensity. So the more stronger the person's blood is, so to speak, is the more fiery, the more it boils. Now here's the line that really threw me. The imkain movan. So based on this, the imkain, if that's the case, it's understood. Shekol mashi yeser kas behepach, that wherever you see more anger, behepach, when someone is defying his will, hariyesh bezet teisvus chayes mebikim harotzen. It has an abundance of energy more than when you fulfill his will. This is where I realize that this is not what it seems to say in the Alter Rebbe's Maimon. There he says the opposite. He says the more you see anger when you don't do his will, the more it shows you how much energy there'll be when you do his will. And here he's saying that the angrier he is, the more you see the energy, you see it more than when you fulfill his will. And in case you're wondering what pshat is, he says in the parentheses, like he says elsewhere, it was also explained above, and I looked it up, page 1298. So he says, why is lav? Meaning by the Eibishter, why does the lav precede the hain? When God says don't do something, it precedes the do something positive, because the hain reaches deeper. When you defy what the king wants, it has more effect on him than the joy that he has than when you do it. So clearly, he's saying here that the defying God's will here that causes anger is actually revealing more his energy than when you do what he wants. And therefore, when he's appeased from his anger, when you appease him and you calm him down, meaning that you correct whatever it is that you caused anger by doing what he wants, through that, you actually draw down more energy. In other words, if you listen to what the king says all day, so obviously you give him satisfaction, you give him nachas ruach, you give him joy. But what happens if you defy what he says, and then you come back and do tshuva, and you appease him, you pacify him? So what he's saying is, you will reveal deeper strength, and the joy will be even greater, because when you defied him, it brought out that anger, that intensity. So when you appease, now you have the strength of that intensity that came from defying him. That wasn't there quite as intense when you just did what he wanted. In other words, defying him brings out more strength, and when you pacify, therefore you access that strength. That's what he says here. If you read the Maimon of the Alter Rebbe, it doesn't seem to say that. There he seems to say, not that the Havana is fundamentally different. There he says something not as powerful. He says that just like you see the anger, the energy, when you don't do it, that just shows you how much power and intensity is when you do what he wants. Which also tells you why it's not a Geroyan Amiti. Because the bottom line is, it's all coming from his powerful strength. But I think when you learn the Rebbe Rashab's way of learning it, you see it's much deeper and therefore much more understandable why it's not a Geroyan. The Im Kain, and here it concludes, Ein ze Geroyan Amiti. And therefore that, when you defied what he said, and you diminish, so to speak, it's not a true diminishment, because through this dafka, you draw down an even more abundant level of energy. That's what he said. So therefore, it's not a Geroyan Amiti. First of all, because the fact that he got angry is not coming because he's diminished. He got angry because of the opposite. He's so great, and that greatness has been somewhat defiled, and through that comes even more taste for seir, dafka through that. So it's not a Geroyan Amiti. That's how the Rebbe Rashab explains this idea of Ein Geroyan Amiti. Now, as I said, when you compare it to the Maimon of the Alter Rebbe, you may not learn pshat like that initially, but only in one aspect. He does say the same idea that there won't be a Geroyan Amiti, but there is the point is because the reason he's getting angry is because of his strength, not because of his weakness. That's essentially what he's saying here. Okay, now, 1 second.
But here, one second. This is a complicated piece. There's a lot of people in this class that are listening. They will listen. I want to make sure that I'm saying everything I want to say before there's any questions. I'll take questions. Just be patient. Be patient. Now, the next section, the Rebbe Rashab is going to explain now what means ba'aver kvede or kvedi. But I think I'm going to stop here because I think the most important thing is to understand this Geroyan Amiti, what he's saying with the Ein Geroyan Amiti. I think I explained it. I think I explained also the way it's compared to the Maimer, the original Maimer of the Alter Rebbe and Tzemach Tzedek Sagos. But I will stop here and take any questions. Go ahead. It looks like the Geroyan Amiti means that eventually something is missing. The Rebbe Rashab is explaining that eventually it's going to be even stronger. But it's a little.
Where do you see the word eventually? I don't see such a word. He just says even the Geroyan is not a true Geroyan because it's coming. No, I don't think you understand the pshat here. He's saying it's coming because it's coming from his. Read the beginning. In the beginning, he says, "Kas is coming from the kas is not coming from his weakness; it's coming from his intensity." Then there's the element des that it adds even more. So listen, it says Geroyan, it just says not a Geroyan Amiti. So it's correct to say that when you mephayas him, when you pacify him and appease him, then there's going to be more tesus chayis. He's going to have more tesus erv'chayis. But the tesus erv'chayis is there already. The very anger is coming from a tesus erv'chayis. Remember, in the Maimon of the Alter Rebbe, I mean, maybe that's the difference between the two. He doesn't even mention kishem ispayis. He doesn't mention that line, kishem isratza rather.
He said, kishem isratza mikasa.
Not in the original Maimon of the Alter Rebbe. That's what I'm saying. Anyway.
But how could you say, could be I don't understand it. How could you say that in that moment it's not a Geroyan? It's thesis oil chayis, but it's in a negative way.
We didn't say it's not a Geroyan. We said it's not a Geroyan Amiti. That's the part. He didn't say there's no Geroyan. First he said there is a Geroyan, a Matishin Keiche, but it's not a true Geroyan. That's what he says. It's not a true Geroyan. The reason is because even when you're defying him,
The reason his anger is coming from his strength, not from his weakness. That's the point. A gedoyin would be if a person is a weak person and doesn't have power and is insecure, like I mentioned. So therefore, when you insult him or you dishonor him, it's a gedoyin amiti. You're diminishing him. Here, you're not diminishing him because his kas is coming from his strength, not from his weakness. That's what he says initially. The second point in this seems to be, that's why when you do pacify him, then not only there's no good, not only then there's no gedoyin amiti, there's no gedoyin altogether, because then you've transformed it. You only have the taste for chayes. Anyway, that's my understanding of it based on the mimer from the Alter Rebbe, at least.
Okay, but what kind of a taste for chayes is this? That the anger is so big. I understand it's not a gedoyin because it says more taste for chayes became a rotten, but in that moment the anger is so big. This matishim koichol.
Anyway, why don't you read it? Read it yourself. And
I read it. That's why they cast.
Okay, look, I explained it best as I could. What should I say?
Move שכל מה שיהיה יסר כעס בעת החרוצה, ויש בזה תספס חייס מביקרים הרוצן. Very powerful.
Read the whole piece. He didn't begin with that line. There's a whole section before that. That the stronger, the more blood there is, the more passion there is, the more the anger will be. That means it's coming from a powerful place.
Okay, so what's Giron? What does it mean, Giron?
Anyway, I don't want to, we can take this, you and I, because there's other people. Let's see if anyone else has any questions. Anybody want to ask anything else? Anybody?
I have a lot of questions, but I want to listen to this class again before I ask them, because you may have explained it. I just need to go back and do it. So, as a lawyer, I'm just going to reserve the right to ask you later.
There's also another point that is important. Remember, we learned earlier, the parentheses I think is very vital here. He said that gvura, when it comes in a negative form, like anger, you'd think is disconnected from the gvura that comes from strength and intensity. He's making very clear that it's not disconnected. It's coming from the same place. That's what he says clearly in the parentheses. He says, Haba Hatalia. In other words, a person who is, like when it says, Atalmid Chochem is Nekim v'Neter, Kenochash. The stronger a person is, the more you can see come from him the opposite strength as well. But even in Klippa, the truth is, what he's saying is that when you see very harsh gvuras, they are rooted in very great place. The problem is they came down in a very negative place. So he's saying that clearly. He says that and that's why gvuras nimtokim b'shosha, because it's not that someone got angry. Okay, now we'll pacify you, we'll appease you, we'll bring you gifts. No, that gvura came from a place that you were negei b'nefesh, like a melech shamachal al kvei machal. So it comes from a very deep tagberus achayis. Unfortunately, because you defied this king, so now it's a very strong anger. So therefore, that's where it's rooted from. Now, I do still not 100% clear whether the Eina Gedoyin Amiti is after you Mephayasim, because then you redeem it and you reveal the powerful, like he says, afterwards, you have even more taste for Chayis than before. Or where we learn in the Maimon of the Alter Rebbe, there it appears that the very fact that it's coming from that intense place, that shows you that it's not really, you're not diminishing him. But again, I want to review it again myself before I come to any conclusions. I'm saying it also to you, Rab Shlomo, and explaining this whole idea. I have to read it a few more times. But it's very clear that the lowest gvura, even when it comes into kas, is coming from a very deep place, because the more blood he has, in other words, the more intensity, the more chayas he has, the angrier he gets, essentially. Like an animal that is provoked is going to be a lot angrier than a docile person. So it's coming from a very intense place, but it's now directed in the wrong place. I have to read this Maimon many times. Okay. I'm going to stop here. I'm going to stop here. We're stopping here. Even though the next section may actually clarify matters, to be honest.
Isn't this connected to maybe the answer that the Rebbe wrote in that famous letter where he said he's wondering as a child how we're going to thank the Galus for it? Isn't this saying that after we do tshuva and we appease the God, the king, so to speak, we're going to bring Tosefes Or to the king because it touches Chayas, the Gvura. So
that's not what the Rebbe says. The Rebbe says, Oit Hashem Ke'anaftabi. That will, Oit Hashem will acknowledge God for his afflicting us.
Right.
So
For being
understand in a way the power that came out of all the suffering we had. I don't know. I don't want to go there right now.
Okay.
Yeah, we talked about that letter a few times. First of all, it says, Oit Hashem will be understanding. We tap that. Listen, the strength that people got from oppression, we can see already. Like when we say, as they were oppressed, they thrived and blossomed. We see that. But that still doesn't mean necessarily that the very darkness itself can be appreciated. But it's connected. But I before we go there, I want to first, we talked about that in the concept of Gvuras Nimtokim B'Sharsha. Yeah.
Thank you. Very powerful.
The next section we'll learn tomorrow, but it can help understand what we're saying, but it could also help make things a little more challenging.
You may want to stop the recording unless anybody has any more questions.
I'll stop the recording now. So we're up to closer to the bottom of page 1338.